I want to welcome you back to the second of three panel discussions we're doing today, centered on new surveys and analysis by the Pew Research Center on the Millennials, the generation of teens and 20-somethings who, as we know, are turning out to be distinctly different from the younger generations that preceded them. One of the things that most distinguishes them, some say defines them, is technology. Their use of cell phones, laptop computers, and not only the internet, but social networking sites to communicate with each other and to learn about what's happening in the rest of the world. When I first linked up with the Pew Research Center about 5 years ago on that reporting project for PBS and NPR to tell the story of this younger generation, I found young people eager to talk about how they interact with new media and how they get information. Here's just a minute's worth of what we heard. Please look at the screen.
I get New York Times delivered daily on email, so I usually do the internet news.
What do I do here? You know, video games or law school? Video games, law school. Video games are kind of, it's a new medium. It's going to be to the 21st century what film was to the 20th century.
I feel like our generation kind of has ADD in terms of we can't just sit down and, let's relax. Okay, Yeah. I'd say quick, fast, in a hurry is pretty much our motto. We want it now.
Just a small sampling of what we heard. And to elaborate on millennials' media and information, we have another superb panel joining us. And I'm going to call them up one by one. The panel consists of, first, Danah Boyd. Please come up. She is a social media researcher with Microsoft Research. She's also a fellow at Harvard University's Berkman Center for Internet and Society. She has specialized in studying social media, Twitter, blogging, and social network sites like Facebook. She studied at MIT. She recently earned her PhD at the University of California at Berkeley. Dylan Casey, please come up. Where are you? Hi. Dylan is search product manager for Google after a successful career as a professional cyclist, including competing on the U.S. Olympic team. Dylan joined Google in 2002, working on building products for Google Search, and he recently launched its real-time search. 99% of the world is grateful to you, Dylan. I don't know about the other 1%. Amanda Lenhart, please come up. She's Senior Research Specialist for the Pew Internet and American Life Project, which lives under the wings of the Pew Research Center. She directs the project's research on teens, children, and families. Her other research specialties include education, gaming, and network communication tools like mobile phones, social networks, and blogging. And finally, the person who will present Pew's findings on this topic, Tom Rosenstiel. Tom. Founding director of the Pew Research Center's Project for Excellence in Journalism. The project specializes in studying the performance of the press, appropriately so, since for 20 years, Tom was a reporter for the Los Angeles Times and for Newsweek. He co-wrote a book on the elements of journalism that has become a Bible for journalism schools and for journalists across this country. Now, after Tom's presentation, the panel is going to trade comments among ourselves for about 45 minutes, and then we're going to take questions from you in the audience. Tom Rosenstiel, the floor is yours. And if you'd rather come up here, if you feel this is easier for you, come on up, or you can do it from your chair.
I don't think I can come up.
All right,
I'm
you're
tethered.
chained to your chair, so do it there.
I am where I am. I am who I am. And I'm glad that I'm the oldest person on this panel, so that we have more points of view here. What I'm going to do for just a few minutes is talk a little bit about the media use and news consumption of millennials that we can infer from the survey data and from other data that we look at. We look at a lot of stuff, a lot of data at the PRC. First of all, millennials, I think, as I pour through this stuff, are the leading edge of the spear. They're doing things with technology, and older generations, I think, are following. and we see this over time, that they'll do things and we think, that's nuts, that makes no sense, that's crazy, I'd never do that. And then 2 or 3 years later, we do that. How many of the boomers are now on Facebook in this room? As I look through the data, I think that millennials are what I would call on-demand grazers for news. They look for what they want when they want it, and they graze across lots of different sources, although I think a limited number of sources, but they don't rely on a main source for news, I think. They share, they network, they're mobile, they're connected when they're away from home. And as I look through the data, I think they're already changing their behavior, and I think Danah can talk about what she's seen in that regard. I'm old enough now that I can't actually see that very clearly.
Neither can I.
As you can see from this slide, a lot of people think that technology makes life easier. Millennials are a little more likely to feel that way, but this doesn't really define them, I don't think. But one thing where they do jump out more is in the idea that it's a good thing to share all these pictures, to post things about themselves, to say, I'm doing my laundry now while they're on Facebook or whatever. I'm betraying some of my own biases here. I shouldn't do that. Look at the difference in terms of millennials being cell-only. Now, will that change once they buy houses and want to have potentially other phones? Who knows? But right now, no. They're twice as likely to be as Gen Xers and a lot more likely than others. They are connected wirelessly when they're away from home, through laptops, through cell phones, to the internet. I was trying to take the millennials quiz on my phone earlier, but I don't really know how to work the thing.
I don't know that you should have admitted that since, but go ahead.
It's okay. It's all right. I'm not going to talk about my kids like Paul did. This to me is interesting because look at the change in behavior. Millennials are less likely, a lot less likely, to blog than they were in 2007. So I think this is a caution to us that what we see people doing now with technology may not be necessarily what they're going to be doing later. I think the technology, well, I'll talk about this in a second, it doesn't define them as much as reflect them. Millennials are more likely to be on social networks, to use cell and text, but I suspect that the rest of us are moving up, are following them in that regard. They're also more likely to post video, to tweet, but these numbers are not huge. Okay, not everybody is doing this all the time, even in the youngest generation. I wonder what it would be like if we had my 13-year-old daughter on there, but never mind. I wasn't going to talk about my kids. Now we get into where people get their news. Interesting, television, this is both cable and broadcast and local that's in this number. So they're watching television, actually a little more than Gen Xers, but certainly less than older generation. The internet, clearly more. Newspapers, somewhat less, and I think there may be some noise in that lowest number. Radio, interestingly, is something that everybody uses, and the numbers aren't changing a lot over time on radio. So where are people going for news when they are online? Well, the young, this generation is of those who are online at all. 81% are online daily for news. So young people who are connected and who are online get news online a lot. And I think that one of the things that's so fascinating to me as I've watched this research over the years is the idea that young people were not interested in the outside world, I think, was wrong. The idea that young people were not interested in the old delivery systems, in appointment viewing, in having to consume your news at breakfast only, That's what was going on. Now that they have a delivery system that meets their behavior, their needs, their personality, they're avid consumers. And the data, I don't have a slide on this, but during the election, this generation was as informed about politics as any other generation. Less so now that politics is working so beautifully here in Washington that they don't have to pay attention. Where are they going online for news? This slide to me is really interesting. They're going to aggregators. Yahoo, CNN, which is a site that's got a lot of material that's not CNN's, Google, MSN, but you look on the right side of that slide at key brands like the New York Times or Fox or any of those. Those are not places that people describe as their main news source. They see the internet as a news source, and what are the options that are available there? In other words, they really are grazers. And we've got research that that will be released later that's not part of this report that indicates how widely they graze or not graze. I think they graze, but I don't think they graze everywhere. I don't think any of us do. So in sum, I would say that as I look at the data, but I'm really intrigued to hear what our panelists have to say, technology reflects the personality of this generation, I think, rather than defines them. But predictions about them are very difficult to make. One reason is because I think millennials are already changing, because as they, because the technology is changing, because their personalities are changing some. The other thing, and this is significant, the landscape is so different that actually asking millennials or any other generation what their media use is like versus what previous generations did is impossible to do, because tweeting and a lot of these technologies didn't exist. We don't know what Gen Xers did when they were 18 in terms of tweeting. We didn't have tweeting then. So some of the data that we can look at in other areas about religious attitudes, about morality, about a host of other things that we can do longitudinally, we can't do when it comes to media use. So I think that we're going to have to turn to other researchers for that kind of thing, which tees up, I think, the rest of our group.
That's great. Thank you. I'm going to come to you next because you do study this all the time, the use of technology. What else? What would you add to the picture of this generation, how it uses technology? And if you want to, what we heard earlier is that I think from Neil Howe, is that they are taking technology and shaping it the way they want it to work for them. It's not just that they're being used by technology. They are using it to be what they want it to be. So expand on that.
Sure. I think that's a great question, and certainly I think what we've heard today really suggests that teens and millennials, and again my focus is generally on teens, but millennials as well.
And you can make the distinction.
Yeah,
there.
And we'll make the distinction. I'll talk a little bit about some of the differences there, because if we really were doing a full cohort analysis, we'd be going to kids 9 to 20. We'd be going 9 to 29. So there are some things about teenagers who eventually will sort of roll into this cohort that we can talk about how they're different, how they're not different. Though of course there are always time of life issues, particularly with adolescents, and they're more surveilled, they're more controlled lives. Their parents are more in charge of their finances and their choices. But getting back to your question about the technology and how the technology is acting upon young people, I think actually I'd like to step back from that idea and look more at a kind of a holistic feedback loop. That it's not just that we're acting on the technology, because we are, and certainly users and teens and young adults use the technology in the ways that they want, which is often the ways that the designers themselves didn't anticipate. But you're still using the technology as it's presented in front of you. You're still using, you can only really do what the technology allows you to do. So there's a certain element of the fact of how people are designing the technology. And let's remember, it's also Gen Xers and boomers who are designing this technology as well as millennials. So it's all of us coming together using this technology. And so I think you really still are constrained in the ways that you're using technology. And one good example of this is the change that we've seen in the blogging numbers. years. So, blogging has declined for both teens and young adults since 2006, 2007, quite dramatically. And one of the things we think is a cause of this is the changes in the use of social networks. So back in 2006, MySpace was really ascendant. And on MySpace, blogging was front and center. It was at the top of your profile. It was very easy to do, and you saw other people's blogs. They were updated frequently. It was a big part of the MySpace culture. Fast forward to today, when people are moving to Facebook, not necessarily away from MySpace, as some of the data suggests, but moving over to Facebook and its affordances. But Facebook doesn't have blogging. Facebook allows you to do something called Notes, but it's not something that the structure of Facebook presents to you. What Facebook presents to you is actually a much shorter status updates, in fact, kind of a micro-blogging. And that's where we see some of teens and young adults' energies going. So I think it's a mix. I mean, certainly designers are cognizant of what young people want and design things to fit those needs and niches. But at the same time, your use of that technology is constrained by what the technology can do.
Okay, and I see you, Danah Boyd, nodding, and I'm anxious to have you pick up on any part of what she said, but I'm particularly interested in how young people are using social networks, not just to communicate, but it's their community. It's how they,
Sure.
organize friendships and so.
I think first off, what Amanda's saying is dead on, and I think that what we've seen is the rise of social network sites have come out at a time where, starting really with teenagers, they're in a social situation where they don't have the same kinds of freedom and flexibility that we took for granted in older generations. And it comes back to what the earlier panel was talking about, issues of a lot of fear. Fear have been unbelievably pervasive in what we've seen with teenagers, and it's continued on into young adults, such that a lot of teenagers that I went and interviewed, they weren't allowed to leave their home, right? This whole thing that we grew up with, be on your bike, get home by dark kind of attitude has pretty much disappeared. And so when one is a fear is a huge component of it. Another big component of it is overstructured time. A lot of, especially more privileged kids in the United States, spend morning to night in activity to activity to activity to activity because their parents think that this is good for them. A lack of geographic mobility, particularly in non-urban environments where they're reliant on parents for cars, where the geography is such that, being out on your bike is not necessarily a way to find where your friends are because of a lot of school choice and a reorganizing of the physical space. And what this all sort of comes down to is a environment where they're trying to find interstitial spaces where they can simply hang out. And so social media came in at a time where young people were looking for places to hang out, and voila, here it is. Here's a place that becomes an online hangout space. And so a lot of the behaviors that you saw, especially with teenagers, but and it continued on, I'll talk about young adults in a second, teenagers looked like what the teenagers were doing whenever we were hanging out before. Conversations boiled down to, joking around, gossiping, flirting, sort of sharing information about what was going on around you. And we look at this, especially as adults, and we're like, this is terrible. How could these people spend so much time doing this completely useless task? And yet at the same time, this is one of the most important learning skills we need out there, which is learning how to actually move around the social world. And so the fact that we've actually taken away in sort of more structured environments and that young people are really sort of pushing to have it is really interesting in that landscape. And they're learning how to make sense of hierarchies and social status. They're learning how to say information and to have it misinterpreted and have to backtrack and figure out how to say it again. And they're working all of that they're doing all that social work, which becomes really powerful. As they switch into sort of young adult spaces and finally have a little bit more freedom, both because they're finally of age to drive, they're in a different geographic environment, whether they're in the military, off at college, or in a work landscape, we see a sort of switch to more mobile uses. And a lot of the social media really combines with that. So the technology gets used as a way to say, hey, let's meet up, right? Let's gather in these places. The key thing to understand with the social network sites is that they're first and foremost about connecting with people that you already know. And I think there's always this misunderstanding that they're about networking and meeting strangers, which was what, when I was a teenager, that's what I was doing online. But that's no longer the case for most teenagers and most young adults. They're there connecting with the people that they already know or the people they desperately wish to know, i.e. celebrities. And what's really interesting in all of this is that when adults adults have spent all this time now for the past 5 years telling young people this is a dangerous, dangerous place. Don't talk to strangers. Don't talk to strangers. But now I love that all of these organizations out there are now trying to go and reach young people through this social media. You're a stranger too, right? Like, you're just as scary. We've done a really good job of convincing them that all strangers are scary. So we have this sort of interesting inflection in all of the social space. So they're thinking about their different ways of becoming part of public, but it's not public to all people across all space and all time. It's public across their peer groups.
I want to, and I do want to move on, but I have to ask you, because it's been raised to me by a number of people, because so much of their learning about social interaction is in front of a laptop computer rather than face-to-face, what are we learning about how they are dealing with people when they have to deal with human beings?
Let's be clear. Teenagers spend, a huge chunk of their day sitting and staring at someone lecturing at them, right? So first off, we've got a structured environment where they're still trying to pass notes and gossip and joke around interstitial spaces that are in person. Once we get out into the young adults, they're definitely interacting with people. And what you hear over and over again from teenagers is, when I ask them, why do you spend all this time online? They're like, because I can't get together in person. Which would you prefer? Definitely getting together in person. But at the same time, so they're doing all of this online, but it's not because they want to be online. It's by and large they want to be in person. They're just having to deal with social sort of situations with which that's not possible. Now that said, in terms of what they are learning, many of you have your BlackBerries in your pocket. I'm guessing that you've had some really interesting moments with colleagues where you've said something that didn't get interpreted the way you intended and had to deal with the ramifications of it. You had to learn, most likely at an older age, how to navigate textual conversations. So the fact that they're engaging in this means that they're actually engaging in a whole multimodal ways of interacting socially that allow them to interact socially in ways that we expect in the professional world. We don't expect a professional world that is purely face-to-face. We have to deal with the phone. We have to deal with text. Now, they do have some variations about what they think is rude, and I actually think this is a delightful generational difference. For some reason, I talk to older workers in white-collar environments, and they'll talk about, it's so interruptive, it's so rude in the workforce. But somehow getting a phone call isn't, right? It's okay to ring up anybody. And what's amazing is you'll see a lot of teenagers who will text one another and be like, can I call you? It's not saying that texting is always preferred, but there becomes an inverted social norm, which is that this is a lighter touch way of checking in before I've actually vocally interrupted you. So I think we've also got these different expectations based on what we assume are standards, but we're seeing other ways trying to think out the same set of logic about what is appropriate, what is a way of navigating these sort of social and professional spaces.
And just to support Danah's point, we have some data that suggests when given a choice of how to communicate, teens will actually, as she said, will pick the face-to-face. That's the default. That's what they want, and they're still communicating face-to-face even outside of the school environment on a daily basis. But because of various locational and sort of geographic constraints, they go to the cell phone, they go to text messaging and social networks as a default, as a way to expand upon that. So yeah, the numbers basically support Danah's point as well.
Dylan Casey, what would you add to all this, and then bring us gently into your world, your focus at Google on search, and how that's characterizing this generation, how they use search. But I want to make this transition, but I want to hang on to some of the points that we've been making as well.
Yeah, sure. So in my professional life, we don't collect age-specific data about our users, but we do collect a significant amount of data around what people are doing, especially on Google products. And we anonymize it, but we look at it at the aggregate level to try to make some sort of inference on, how are our products being used, how are they performing, which ones are used more often, and how are they being used. And we use that from a perspective of trying to understand what we're doing well and what we're not doing well, or how we might change our strategy in terms of developing new products. But specifically in the search realm, for the longest time we looked at search trends as a way to make inferences about topicality or what was important, or trying to determine geographically based trends. And recently, with this kind of proliferation of what I refer to as a colloquial term, real-time search, is where trends are telling us what people are looking for and kind of surfacing topics from a perspective or from a dynamic of, hey, I want to find out about this, or I'm interested in this, or this kind of looking for information dynamic. Real-time content, if you look at it at the aggregate level, also allows us to identify what are topics, what's being said on the internet right now. And so it's a slightly different dynamic. And when we spent a lot of time thinking about how we wanted to build the product and what were the use cases and who were the users that we were trying to build for, we realized that the reason that we couldn't avoid, because we really tried to avoid this term real-time search. I mean, because, and Danah probably knows from her time ago, like speed has always been important, and real-time has this notion of right this second.
I thought it was already real-time.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, all of search and the information that we can gather on the internet and then index and make available through different mechanisms, speed has always been important. But we think, and we've, kind of our own analysis and research internally, is that real-time has come about and is important is because oftentimes the content that is being published via these different mechanisms, whether it's Facebook or Twitter or a whole host of different publishing platforms, is generally only useful or relevant for a small window of time. Like, if I say, oh, the traffic on I-95 is really horrible right now, like, nobody cares that I said that a week ago, but you might care if I said that 5 minutes ago or a second ago or an hour ago. And so we really focused on how can we make that. So we focused on the pipeline to get that content and put it in our index, and then make use of it, like make it searchable, make it relevant somehow. And so that whole process from like thinking about it to actually product launch involves a lot of thought around how people are using technology, what kind of information and feedback do we get, and it's interesting because. We're a metric-driven company. It's all about numbers, and oftentimes we probably don't look externally enough for feedback or input, especially at the level. We're very uncomfortable with doing anything that's based on analysis that is specific to somebody's personal information. Mm-hmm. Right? Privacy is so important to us, and has been from the very beginning. And it's interesting because we have two twists on privacy. Internally, we're completely open with our information. There's no such thing as like secret projects, and because that's the corporate culture is this idea that access to all of the information about what we're doing and what we're thinking and research and thoughts and meeting notes and stuff like that is essential for us to operate in the way that our founders and executives want us to behave. However, at the same time, we realize that we're in this position of collecting so much information about our users and internet traffic and the internet itself, and understand that if we don't go to great lengths to protect that privacy, then we'll basically just implode internally. And so we have a very interesting relationship with privacy and personal details. And so it creates a certain amount of tension internally to try to understand how do we adjust to what we're being told. I have a 4-year-old son who'll probably never, ever understand the concept of a compact disc, right? To him, he's just looking for play buttons. Whether they're on devices or on the internet, he just wants to play music by hitting this button. And so he's being shaped by technology, and then in turn, he's shaping the way that we develop products because, for example, we recognize that a huge number of searches on Google were music-related or entertainment-related. And so we said, okay, well, we need to figure out how to, address that. And so we developed products, and now you can go to Google and you can search and just hit a play button. And so there's an interesting dichotomy and interaction ecosystem between how young people that are new to technology and new to accessing information are affected by it, and then in turn how their interaction with that technology affects the actual production and development of it.
Danah.
Can I take up the point about privacy? Because it actually makes me think something that really critical. There is a large myth out there that young people don't care about privacy. And I think that that really needs to be dispelled in all of this. Young people care deeply about privacy, but how they actually think through privacy looks very different than older folks. And I think actually it's more life stage issues than anything else. But we sort of can tease some of this out. First off, there's also a distinction between what we talk about in more industrial conversations about PII, personally identifiable information, and what I talk about jokingly as PEI, personally embarrassing information. And I actually think that the latter is what young people are much more concerned about than the former, right? And they're really thinking through what are the social elements there. The other thing we have to sort of take into account in all of this is what kind of environment they're living in and the kinds of ways in which they interact socially. So, you and I might be having this conversation as friends in the schoolyard, talking back and forth, and, I tell you things, you might forget some of it you thought was really interesting and you decide to share with the room. And this is a perfectly reasonable way in which we have regular conversations. Part of it is that this conversation, except for the fact that we're mic'd and cameraed and all sorts of other things, would be, private by default, public through effort. What happens in a social media landscape is an inversion of that. It becomes public by default, private through effort. And so you hear teenagers talk a lot about this and young adults talking about this of like, I write that I'm bored, but who's going to really pay attention unless they want to talk back to me? So I'll write that I'm bored publicly, not because I'm announcing it to all people across all space and all time, but because I would love to find somebody else who's bored amongst my friend group who wants to chat with me. But if I'm going to tell Amanda something that's going to really embarrass her, I'm going to take it to a private environment, and we'll really work through that. What this means is with technology, there's an expectation of trust about, just like there is with this conversation, if we had a private conversation and I told you not to tell anybody, and then you spread the entire room, I'd be really angry with you. And it's a violation of trust. It's not the fact that she couldn't do it, it's the fact that I expect her not to. The same thing ends up operating with technology, which is that once the young people have worked out what they think is the social norms of that particular space, when the technology changes the rules, young people get upset. It's not because things weren't public, but making things more public or changing the scale of publicity really does impact them because they're trying to navigate the space accordingly. The other sort of factor in all of this to really take into account is a calculation of what can be gained versus what can be lost. Young people, by and large, when we're taking generalizations, are calculating all of the things they might gain from being public. Being cool amongst their friends, that's a big gain, right? Like maybe getting the attention of, a celebrity, that's a big gain. The possibility of becoming a celebrity themselves, that's a big gain. Most of you in the room, especially those with a political bent, are always thinking about everything you have to lose, right? And that's the calculation you make with these spaces. What's really interesting is that this is inflected by socioeconomic positions more than anything else as we sort of see the transition. So young kids who are on the path to Harvard or Yale or want to be, or their parents have wanted them to be since they were 5, they're going to make these calculations about all that they could possibly lose much earlier than kids who are not really thinking about college, but are thinking about what it means to sort of get attention and get a job that was about publicity. So when we think about all of these issues around privacy, we can't just talk about personally identifiable information because you know what? They're not making calculations about governments and corporations. They're making calculations about very much intimate and direct power over them. Parents, teachers, college admissions officers, potential local bosses. And we have to sort of think about it in that space and why they have certain reactions. So when a technology changes the system, they get upset because of the change of norms.
Okay, we've got a lot of nodding heads and anxious people. I want to let Tom say something, and then Amanda, and I've got a question.
Well, I think one of the things that's important, if we want to bring this back to the question of what people are going to learn about public life and what we call the news. The old media platforms essentially was a form of force feeding. The news was bundled by editors or producers at a newscast or a newspaper or a radio station, and you had some limited choices if you were reading the newspaper, which sections you were going to look at and which stories you'd read. And in television, you had fewer. You had to kind of sit through the whole wheel. I could tune out, and the research shows that I would completely tune out and forget that story that you just did, and I'd remember the next one because it interested me. So what's going to happen now that the news, that we can't force feed in the media, and that the news has essentially been unbundled? I, as a consumer, can find the story I want, and the data suggests that that's what people are doing. They don't consume news all at once. They consume it serially through the day, and there are these spikes. When people hear something, they get interested and they go look for that story. So what is that going to mean about, how society is going to fall apart now that I can't force feed you what I think is important to you? I think what we're seeing in the data suggests that when people decide that something is worth knowing about, they now have the power to go learn about it. The campaign is very revealing. People of many different ages, even much younger than millennials, became excited and became plugged in, became interested, used different channels of technology than had been used for politics before. So in much the same way that speakers or a questioner mentioned, I want to get a bus stop near my community college. That is, I think, how we might anticipate media consumption is going to happen in the future. When I have a problem that I want to learn about, I have the capacity to learn about it. And I have the tools. I know how to use this technology to learn about it. So one of the key things for those of us in the information business, I think, is going to be how do we make stuff seem relevant? How do we make it clear that this is a bus stop for you?
Do we just give up, though, on the idea that we who know the news business, know about journalism, should decide what's important? And
no, and these guys probably have data on this too, but the data that I've seen suggests that people are still saying what's new. That's, I think, an almost human instinct. And there are phrases for this in different languages. My high school newspaper that I edited was called Habari Gani, which means what's happening in Swahili. And that's a term that that people have in almost every culture. There's some variant of that phrase. And the research suggests that people do go to top headlines. The research also suggests, interestingly, that and this is why there's a war coming with Google. The research also shows that just going to Google and reading the headline, what the news source is, that's the New York Times or whatever, and the first sentence is for many people enough. That I can get a lot of news by just grazing across what you consider to be the appetizer, I consider to be the meal.
Amanda, you want to?
So yeah, I wanted to actually go back to the point that Danah was making, where she was talking about the difference between public and private, and come back and talk a little bit about some of the places of conflict between young teens or older teens and millennials and older generations around this public versus private. Because I think what happens, and in my own work, I get asked a lot about don't teenagers and don't young adults know that employers and college people are looking at their profiles? Why do they put all this information out there? And as Danah pointed out, a lot of it has to do with this fact of not necessarily being concerned, but having in your mind a particular audience. But I think what happens now is because everything is public by default, there's no way to do what we do in our personal and sort of physical interactions, which is code switch. The way I act to my mother is different than the way I act to Lee Rainey, my boss, and the way I act to Danah Boyd. And when I'm with Danah in person, I can make those calculations and calibrations. But when I present myself in a digital space, I don't have that ability to make those kinds of nuanced choices. Or if I do, it's a little bit of a blunt instrument. It's like a hammer instead of a fine-grained sort of laser tool. And because of this, you get into situations where, I think this is an example you used at one point, Danah, where there was a young man, African-American, who wanted to be admitted to an Ivy League institution. And he had gotten in and he had great grades and he was doing really well. And then an admissions officer goes and looks at his Facebook profile, gets access to it in some manner, and sees that he's throwing gang signs and that he is, associating himself with gang activity. And the officer thinks, oh my gosh, we don't want this person to come to our institution because they're going to bring this gang activity. But what we're not getting is that he's doing that to be authentic in his friend group. It may not actually be that he's a member of a gang, but he's doing that to build that kind of rapport and authenticity in his network of peers, which is the audience, and the audience that he's thinking of. So what I think all of us is a big challenge for all of us as we go out and start interacting with millennials, interacting with teens, is remembering that when we look at their online self-presentation through a social network, on Twitter, you're not the intended audience, and that if you're just interacting with this person in another medium, the way they may be showing themselves to you would be very different, and we need to take that into account.
But aren't they now able to make it private much more easily than they used to?
No. Not only are they not able to, Facebook keeps making it harder. So for those of you who didn't pay much attention in December, Facebook changed the sort of default privacy settings and have proudly announced that 35% of the population went out of their way to change the settings. That means that 65% made their material public. And I'm watching this data streaming in, and I'm watching all of it, and it's not meant to be public. And one of the most heartbreaking cases that I actually had to deal with in the fallout of this was a woman whose ex-husband was after her daughter. And they had moved across the country to get away from the situation. The daughter and the lawyer and the mother had sat down in very detailed discussions, talked about how to make this, to allow her to have a life. And having a life in high school required her to have a Facebook. Had really gone out of their way to create a Facebook with her, with all of the privacy settings set down, brought in a tech guy to help sit it out. December rolls around. She didn't know what she was doing. She clicked yes, straight through. Everything was suddenly public. And so one of the things that's really frustrating in all of this is that most people, and Amanda's data shows this over and over again, it's like, yes, there are people that are going out of their way to figure this out. There are definitely people who want it, but the technology is not making it easy.
Very true.
And we are seeing this sort of being a constant conflict, and there's usually a public justification, especially using the rhetoric of young people don't care about privacy. And one of the things I think that really also needs to be highlighted is that the young people who are least privileged in our society have a lot more to lose by a lot of what goes on in these systems. And we really have to think about what kind of structures we need to put in place to help those who are most marginalized.
Aren't we asking, I mean, through all of this, underlying all of this, it seems to me one of the points is that we are asking these young people to make these decisions about public-private much younger than previous generations. I mean, they're being asked to make some pretty profound or consequential decisions at a much earlier age. Am I right about that?
Absolutely. I mean, if you think in the past, we have, like, think about juvenile records. Your juvenile records can be sealed. If you commit a crime or engage in some kind of activity when you're under 18, that doesn't count when you're an adult. And that's partly because we've decided that young adults and people under the age of 18 at least don't have the same kind of judgment that you do when you're older. And yet now we expect them to have that same kind of judgment in their sort of ability to determine what's appropriate for self-presentation when we don't necessarily expect them to have that kind of judgment in their actions.
And I would argue that actually this is changing for all people of all ages. That we're seeing a lot more persistence of data today ever. And I say that even for those of us who were speaking out in public, right? If you're a journalist out there, you might have written a newspaper article that might have gone into microfilms in some library off there. Now this is easy to pull back of the thing you wrote 10 years ago that, you know what, was kind of embarrassing. Right? So we're seeing a persistence that goes out. What is challenging for young people is that they're trying to find spaces where there are other young people there. You know, one of the things I'm kind of entertained by is that in most of my interviews lately, I've been reminded that Facebook is for old people because it's now what's fun about hanging out with your parents is they're reminiscing about their own high school experiences. That's kind of lame. And so we're seeing all of these different inflections about public never meant all people across all space and all time. And I think professionally and socially and personally, we're having to deal with a level of information persistence, information searchability, information replicability, information scalability that we've never seen before.
If they're not doing Facebook, what are they doing instead?
I think they're still on Facebook.
They're just not passionate about it like they were. Their parents are deeply passionate.
Fascinating. Dylan?
Yeah, I mean, it's true, right? There's probably a lot of photos that I wouldn't necessarily want shared of myself that are in a box in my closet. But for kids today, and for this generation, they're all online. And to both Amanda and Danah's point, it's just behind the click of a button. And that's kind of scary, and there's significant ramifications from that. I agree that it's really important, and it's kind of the responsibility of everybody that is developing these technologies and building these products to really think hard about that. And speaking on behalf of Google, like we spend a lot of time trying to do that, and we make mistakes. And when we do, we try to say, hey, we made a mistake, and we're trying to fix that right this second.
Of course, your friends are now scanning up those photos and putting them on Facebook for you.
Yes, I know.
And all
Judy's
of
got them here. They'll be on screen.
No, but and that's you're absolutely right, and that is just the reality that we live in right now, and we need to figure out ways to have rigorous discourse around what we're going to do about it and how we're going to handle it.
With all of this, I want to try to project ahead to what this may say about this generation as it gets older in the workplace and so forth. So feel free to weigh in on any of that. But as I think about search again, I'm thinking about what one of the young people said in that video that we showed. I remember her very well. Columbus, Ohio. She made the comment about, we're just so used to getting answers to everything right now.
Right.
We met another young woman in Birmingham, Alabama, who said, we think all the worst problems in the world, whether it's AIDS or anything else, can be solved because we know where to go to get information. We want answers. We want to get it fixed.
Right.
Do you at Google think about these kinds of things when you think that this younger generation is now, they've been weaned, they've grown up expecting answers immediately to almost everything?
Well, yeah, I mean, I hear it every single day in one manner or another that speed matters. And, of course, that's probably pretty specific to just some of our products, but I think in general, the notion as bandwidth improves, as access to the internet improves and more people get access to the internet, along with that, the importance of how quickly they can get the content that they're looking for becomes important as well. I think, what's interesting, whether it's news or blogs or web pages, to the extent that people can either have a browsing experience where content is just being pushed to them versus when their experience is really around, okay, well, here's what I want to find out about. And there's so many different ways that you can engage with content with those different dynamics, right? Statistically, we see that there are fewer people that are going to the internet, or at least our properties, just in a browse mode, right? Our news homepage, for example, gets far less page views than an actual news results page. And the reason is because we serve news results pages when people are looking for a specific, or enter a query, and we think, oh, well, that's a significant news query. So they get that information interstitial in there. But we see less of that kind of browse. But let me just say a point. But what's interesting is that we also recognize that there is an appetite for just say, hey, just tell me what's happening right now, or tell me some information. And so the speed at which we can deliver that becomes even more important in that specific dynamic.
Well, that previous point you made about, they come to the internet with an idea in mind of what they want to look for. Where do those ideas come from? Where do those...
Oh, well, yeah, I reference music a lot because it's something that we spend a lot of time thinking about. This notion of the top 40, right? Is it the top 40 because those are the 40 most listened to songs, or are those the 40 songs that the record labels want to promote the most? There's research that suggests that people like to listen to music that they've heard before. So that's why this whole feedback mechanism gets created. But then what happens when you start to say, well, here is music based on what people are looking for? And back to your point, to your question, well, how do they know to look for it? Well, the social networks come into play, right? Because it's like a friend of yours. Originally it was, I made this mixtape for you, right? And this was music that somehow I had gathered up in various ways, and I've made a mixtape for you, and I'm giving it to you. Well, now that dynamic has completely changed in the way that people are creating playlists, and that gets stored in their online social profile, and they choose to share that. Well, that has a completely different way of getting disseminated.
Tom, bring this back to news and information and where it comes from and where these ideas get planted in their head. I mean, is it because one of my favorite quotes from a woman, a consultant we interviewed a few years ago for this project, she said, young people, she said, they may not go to news as much as older generations. She said her most memorable comment from I think a young teen was, I don't have to go looking for the news. When something is important, I'll hear about it. My friends will text me, or it'll show up on Facebook.
Right. If you look at sort of what was the most important sort of finding in media research in the 20th century, it was that media doesn't tell people what to think, it tells them what to think about. And now that that force feeding is changing, they are getting their cues about what to think about from many more places. The authorities that people have may be a friend who they think is cool and has knowledge of things that they are interested in, and says, oh, I like this college, or I think Barack Obama's neat, or I'm interested in this. And that suddenly becomes an agenda-setting influence. So I think that part of it has to do with what's important. What are my problems? What are my needs right now? If you go and you study pedagogy and you go to a room and you say, when's the last time you learned something new? People will tell you about a situation that they were in where they actually had a need to learn this stuff. Now, it may be an artificial need, maybe a test tomorrow, or it could be that you're suddenly on a sailing ship, you've never been sailing before, and you're going to have to learn to tie these knots or you're on vacation and suddenly the Mayans are interesting because you're there and the ruins are in front of you. So I think the issue is going to be, where are the cues coming from? Where are the agenda-setting, influencing things coming from? They're no longer controlled by the media, but the curiosity can be satisfied by the media.
I want to take this up. Over the holidays, I was in a movie theater, and I was delighted to watch two parents clearly arguing about who was in a movie of the past. And the kid kept going, "You're wrong. You're wrong. Right? Here's the right answer." And this idea that it wasn't about memory, which was the game of keeping information of the past, but in some ways there were certain things that were facts, and IMDb had them, and parents didn't. And of course, the parents kept getting more and more frustrated, being like, "But I remember it right." And you're wrong. And so one of the things I think is really interesting is the degree to which young people assume certain things can be acquired and obtained through the digital media. And they don't expect that they have to memorize or remember certain things because it's there somewhere. And this presents us a whole set of new and interesting challenges. First off, anything that Google pumps up at the top is right, regardless of how it was produced or all of the implications of that. And this creates some interesting elements of it, especially as it relates to education, which is that over and over again, I spend time in schools where teachers are like, anything in the New York Times is right, anything in Wikipedia is wrong. And I use New York Times for a reason, right? We've had ongoing fraught questions about how news is produced and how we have to think about the truthiness, shall we say, of said news. And I think it's really interesting that what we're also seeing is that at some level, young people, especially younger adults who've gone through college, get that there's something mostly right about Wikipedia, even when things are sort of wrong. And here's what I think is absolutely critical about Wikipedia, which becomes essential for thinking about these kinds of things, which is that every single edit on Wikipedia is publicly documented, which means that you can actually see the history and the biases of all of these people and all of the changes as this article got battled out to make. You don't get to see what happened in the editing room of a newspaper, or how that news story got spun to have a specific kind of headline that, of course, gives a totally different slant to it. And what's really interesting is to think about crowdsourcing as a meaningful means of information aggregation and access. And I think
I don't know what that means.
That taking all sorts of people in to sort of produce it at once rather than having an expert. And so to the news point, what we see in terms of status updates being a source of news is the idea that crowdsourcing, my friends will collectively tell me what is relevant so that things will bubble up as it relates to me. Information around there will bubble up, and it will slowly get worked out and negotiated as sort of more data comes in. And I think we have to think about that changing landscape.
Right. And I think the part that I think about when talking about news, when talking about music, when talking about crowdsourcing, is this idea of digital curation, that in our lives today, in the past it was the news media that curated things for us. It showed us what to look at and where to go. Books and book publishers did the same thing. And now we have a whole bunch of different kinds of curators. We can get our curation from a blog from that guy whose voice we really like, or from the people that we follow on Twitter, or from the people on our Facebook network, as well as from the mainstream and traditional media. And so I think what's really happening, whether it's crowdsourcing, whether it's Google, whether it's news, is that we're opening and broadening the opportunities for different curators to sort of show their slice of the universe, and you can now pick and choose what you want to hear and who you want to get your information from, and get it from a variety of curated sources. So we still want, I think, our material and our media to be curated. There's too much. The fire hose, Google offers up so much information. Others offer up so much information we can't possibly absorb it all. But having different curators, I think, allows us to get different windows and yet still the kind of customized information we're looking for.
Tom, and then we're going to take questions from all of you, so start thinking about what you want to say or pose to our panel.
I think the point that Amanda and Danah make points to another point about how the news business needs to change, which is that the news used to be basically shoveling information at people. Information is now a commodity in such wide supply that it has limited value, and you can't really charge for it, at least at the moment. But information that does more than simply provide facts to people, that may be unique, that can't be found anywhere else, that authenticates, that accomplishes something more than simply telling you what movie was he in or who was that guy. That's where news organizations that aspire to sort of survive are going to have to go. They're going to have to produce things that I worked at the LA Times for a long, long time, and we had in the left-hand column on the front page, we had something that was called a non-dupe, and a lot of your prestige came from how many non-dupes you did. I'd been there about a year when I said, why is this thing called a non-dupe anyway? And they said, because it's considered a non-duplicated story, something that can be found nowhere else. And essentially, I think that's where the news business aspires to go, because you can't make a living providing information that people can find everywhere.